hopefully what I'm going to talk about will be translatable to anyone who's teaching in tax or teaching more generally, so it's not just kind of law specific stuff. So I feel really small behind this desk, so I'm just peeking out here. In terms of my background, so today is really a reflection on my first year in academia, and specifically my first year teaching international tax law and policy, which I teach to postgraduate students at Leeds who are predominantly international. So kind of as Yvonne was saying earlier, I think this year I had one UK or home student in my class, and everyone else was from all around the world. And I've given it a slightly snappier title than is in the programme, because I thought the programme should explain a bit more what I'm talking about. But taking inspiration from making tax digital, I'm talking about making tax inclusive from a teaching perspective. Now, I always have thought myself that tax is quite an exclusive subject. Generally one perceived as very technical, difficult, reserved for the most intelligent people. And you might be thinking, yeah, we like that reputation. But from a teaching perspective, that's not the best. So I've been working on how I can try and challenge some of those preconceptions that students as well might have about tax. That impacts on their ability to really engage with the subject. So I am thinking about this from two main kind of concepts: internationalisation of the curriculum and the student body, because as I said, my experience is predominantly teaching international students, and also pedagogy and literature around working with students as partners. And I'm really interested in in particular using tax law as a tool to break down some of the stereotypes in higher education, specifically around international students. But I think this is also, again, translatable to other kind of groups and cohorts of students. But as I say, my experience is with international students, so that's what I will focus on. So a very brief bit about me. I come from the wonderful city of Hull. If anyone hasn't visited, after Preston, I think Hull shouldn't be next on your list of places to visit. I was a law and accounting student at the University of Leeds, and was actually very torn between the two professions. Ended up going with law. I went through the kind of traditional route in terms of, after my degree, did the LPC, went and did a training contract at an international law firm, and then ended up qualifying as a corporate tax solicitor. I was heavily involved in kind of volunteering in what we had was a legal advice clinic at the time when I was a student. And then at 2 years PQE, the opportunity came up to move into academia. They were specifically looking for tax people. So I like to think that it was a kind of fated opportunity that I wasn't necessarily expecting. But yeah, over the last year, I have been a lecturer in the School of Law. And I am also involved in the management of our community engagement projects. We don't have a kind of clinic format at the moment, but basically overseeing our kind of legal volunteering projects with external organisations. When I'm not doing tax, I'm usually doing musical theatre, and maybe you'll see that. I'm not going to sing or dance, but you may see reflected in some of the things I'm talking about the fact that I'm a bit of a drama queen. So, embarking on life in academia was a bit of a shock to the system. I very quickly discovered that practicing in domestic tax law and teaching international tax law were two quite different things, and it significantly highlighted lots of gaps in my knowledge. So I would say over the last year I've probably worked far harder than I anticipated, and it's been kind of as challenging a job as practice ever was. But you know, I kind of thought to myself, it will be fine, you know, if I'll do all the reading, I'll put in all the extra work, and you know, I'll be able to do a good job of it. So after a full summer of preparing and stressing and thinking, how am I going to be able to do this? And I thought, no, it's okay, I'm prepared, I'm ready. And then this comment came from a student that destroyed my soul. And so this was after what I thought was a really riveting class on the allocation of taxing rights in cross-border transactions for corporate income tax. And yeah, so this kind of led me to really reflect on how I teach tax law. I watched a really funny TED talk the other day by an American science high school teacher, and he talked about having this horrifying realization that he had become the stereotype of a science teacher. And yeah, the same thing happened to me. And you know, I was kind of worried that I was really reinforcing some of these stereotypes about tax being a bit dull and a bit boring, when we all know it's the best thing ever. So amongst lots of the different roles that I do within the School of Law, teaching international tax law to international students has been one of the biggest challenges in my career so far. So I'm going to talk a bit about some of the, I guess, specific challenges and what I intend to do about them going into my second academic year. So I mentioned a bit about internationalisation of the curriculum. I won't talk too long about this, but just kind of some of the literature, what internationalisation of the curriculum is all about. So understanding global perspectives, considering the local and the personal, engaging with other cultures, addressing different value systems, etc. Using non-Western sources and exploring kind of diverse cultural contexts. So I thought at the beginning of the year that if I just made reference to a few countries, you know, outside this one, then that was making my module international. And I've realised now that it's much, much more than that. And then I also mentioned working with students as partners, so I really want to bring these two concepts together. So the students as partners approach is kind of what it says on the tin, all about learning and working together, authentic engagement between staff and students to produce transformative learning experiences, critical reflection, new ways of thinking, co-creation is really central to the students as partners approach. And I have, I guess, a bit of a concern that this sort of approach to teaching may sometimes be reserved just for, you know, English-speaking students, home UK students, and this perception that somehow international students aren't really capable of this sort of approach. And also that this sort of approach doesn't work for a module like tax, which might be perceived as corporate or, you know, kind of less able to use kind of approaches like this as, say, modules on kind of social law and social justice and those sorts of areas. But I disagree. And I think tax is capable and international students are capable of adopting this approach to teaching. So this kind of relates to a wider project that I'm doing around teaching and international students, but these are just some drawing on the literature, drawing on things that people have said to me during my first year as in academia, some of the kind of stereotypes that may exist around international students and their capabilities. So yeah, things around they don't like interactive teaching, just want passive learning, can't understand or develop critical thinking skills, those sorts of things. And I thought, okay, fair enough. Maybe that was reflected at times in my tax module. But then I started to think, aren't we really looking at this the wrong way around, at least in the context of tax law? Because, and tax more generally, there is a lot of other literature out there that suggests that learning tax is like learning a foreign language. And there are just some examples there on the slide. So for those that don't speak the language of tax, it may appear incomprehensible and frustratingly so. It usually takes several years of training to become fluent in the language of tax law. And, you know, I had several years of training and I still wouldn't say that I'm fluent in the language of tax law, but I'm, you know, much more comfortable with it than probably the average undergraduate or master's student. So then I started to think, if this is true, and I think it is, then the majority of my students are trying to learn a foreign language in another foreign language. So is there something peculiar about tax law that makes it more challenging for international students to grasp, as they've essentially got this double hurdle? They're still getting to grips with the basics of the English language, and then they have to try and adapt that to this specialist technical area. So some of the ideas that I'm going to think about are my own ideas, some in collaboration with the Languages Centre, who I went to kind of feeling like this, what can I do? And also some ideas drawn from the literature in the area. And that's something that's been quite challenging, because if you look at the literature around teaching international students more generally, the consensus is the need to be clear, to convey things simply, to be short, to repeat things over and over again for kind of maximum impact. But I found that really difficult when mixed with tax law. So it's this kind of interaction of two, you know, a group of students and a topic that both have particular stereotypes attached to them. And what can I do when kind of faced with the interaction of them both? And in my view, so I've worked quite closely with the Languages Centre at the university, and I'm continuing to do so, but it's my view that the book for language development shouldn't just stop with the Languages Centre, because they don't have the expertise to teach something like tax law language, you know, in their kind of in-sessional and pre-sessional courses. And my view is that all students are capable of the deep learning that we would really like them to experience in tax law, but that there are certain things that we should do as teachers to kind of meet them halfway, or maybe even a bit further than halfway, to ensure that they're really kind of engaging with the subject. So some of the things I have been thinking about are, what about when I first meet my students? So reflecting on kind of the year that's gone, some of the challenges that I faced were, you know, pretty basic in terms of, you know, things that are out there already that people have written about, that they experience with students generally, not just international students, but the, you know, the lack of discussion, the silence in the room when you're trying to get people to engage in debate, a real reluctance to share experience. So on this module we have a 2-hour seminar every week, but a lot of the time that just became a lecture. It was just a kind of one-way dialogue of me telling the students about tax law. And from colleagues, and again from things that have been written that are out there on this subject, that seems to be fairly normal for sort of business type modules where the cohort is predominantly international students. I now, just recently finished supervising a number of those students who've then gone on to write tax LLM dissertations. And I've been amazed getting to know them more kind of one-on-one, how much valuable experience they have. You know, they come from all over the world at all different stages of life. You know, very few of them have got any tax experience, but they've got a real wealth of experience in practice, whether that's legal practice or elsewhere, that they didn't bring to the classroom, which makes me think, is that a shyness or a reluctance, or is it because they didn't understand how their wider experience could relate to tax? Language barriers, of course, exist, but I sometimes feel like they're used as a bit of an excuse by both students and staff, when actually there are a lot of things that we could do to try and break down some of the issues associated with language barriers. And changing non-standard teacher-student roles, so the background that a student has come from will obviously impact how willing they are to engage in different styles of teaching. And I appreciate that I might be a little bit intense on day one of international tax law and policy, so making sure that I'm kind of explaining my sort of students as partners approach from the beginning. So where do I want to get to? Well, next year I want to really know my students and for us to have a sort of tax community between us. I feel part of lots of different tax communities, so research communities like this, you know, the Women in Tax group, tax communities from practice, and I don't see why my LLM tax class shouldn't also be a kind of tax community within the school in the way that we have with our PhD students, for example. And at a really basic level, I just want them to be engaging in discussion, considering a range of views and bringing in their own experience, thinking about how tax has impacted them in the past. And creating an environment, I guess, where students feel really empowered to think about issues around tax and not kind of interrogated by me asking them questions and the following silence. So I'm going to do like a pre-session introduction this year, so using technology like Padlet, getting students to kind of share a story about themselves before we all actually meet together. And I'm going to do an introductory lecture which will bring all of the students together rather than just in their separate seminar groups, where I'm kind of telling a story of how I want the tax classes to look for the year ahead. And I would really like, I don't know if this is hugely wishful thinking, but I would really like that to be the only time that I spend the majority of the session standing up in front of the students and speaking at them. This approach has worked on some of my non-tax undergraduate modules, so I'm hoping that if I kind of set the ground rules from the outset, then students will kind of know what's expected of them and what my role is in the group. An icebreaker exercise, which everyone loves. I'm not going to ask everyone to tell me a fascinating fact about themselves, but I am going to ask them to do some drawing. So the first thing that I'm going to ask them to do is to draw independently what the tax system means to them. And I have done this myself. So this took me, you can see I'm highly skilled in art. So this took me 5 minutes, kind of set a timer, and I just scribbled on a piece of paper all the things I could think of that made me think about tax. So I've got like a chicken drumstick and a cookie, thinking about kind of sin taxes and the sugar tax, those sorts of things. I've got a shark swimming in the sea to represent tax havens. And thinking about, this bit kind of over in the corner, how tax impacts more widely on politics and different kind of minority groups, low income, high income, business. The fact, these dollars and a sad face, the fact that I have to pay tax, that makes me sad. So what I want the students to get from this is impact from the very beginning in terms of recognising that, as I've put the little crown there, tax is king in terms of tax kind of impacts on everything. And I want them to be able to recognise from that what they already know about their own tax system in their home country, and also how tax relates to other things that they might not necessarily have thought about before coming to study tax law. Thinking about how tax has impacted their lives. So I'm hoping that this will be a kind of a nice sort of eye-opening task for the students to share their experiences at the outset. And if they will allow me to, I would like to also kind of share them in an online forum, because I will ask some people to talk about theirs, but we won't have the time to go through them all. So I think it'll be a nice thing, again, creating that kind of tax community for everyone to be able to see what other people kind of drew from that. So thinking about who international tax law is for, for me, it should be for everyone. As I said at the beginning, even though these preconceptions about tax exist, I do think it is accessible for everyone if it's taught in the right and explained in the right way. So I have to recognise that my students are from all over the world, making sure that they are represented within the module, making sure that I don't have to, I've put tutor biases there, but because I practiced here, and I also studied law here, my tendency, as you would expect, is to give examples based in UK law. And I'm trying less and less to do that, even though I might be talking, about a jurisdiction that I don't know much about, but it's kind of taking the time to go away and kind of research into that so you can give a broader range of examples. The module currently is split kind of semester 1, we mainly look at VAT, and semester 2, income taxes, but with a real focus on corporation tax. So I would like to look more at individual income taxes, mainly because that is an area of real interest to me, but I think in particular it's an area that is really ripe for allowing students to consider lots of different perspectives. So I really want to kind of promote the internationality of the classroom, and I've put on there kind of recognising tax cultures, so giving students the ability to connect their own background and their own country's kind of tax system with the broader law and policy that we're considering in the classroom. Reducing content is a really key thing as well, ultimately not because I'm lazy, but just because this year I was racing through content thinking, well, I've got to tell them about this, and if I tell them about this, they've got to know about that. So if I would ultimately like to do less teaching so that there is more time in the class for those kind of really critical debates around, things like whether particular tax rules in one country are sort of transferable to others. Just a very brief example of the sort of case studies that I would be thinking about. So looking at developing countries that would allow students who are, say, from a developed country to compare their system with a developing country, or similarly, a student from another developing country to consider a country that has a relatively kind of successful VAT system, but has had kind of ups and downs in terms of implementing VAT and then, getting rid of it and bringing it back, and using these case studies to enable students to kind of critically consider some of the basic principles, like the pros and cons of having a VAT, why VAT has spread around the world, why some countries still don't have a VAT, why they're in the minority. And these sorts of case studies, I hope, will really empower students that come from developing countries. They will feel more represented when perhaps they're not in things like EU and OECD policy. And I also think considering developing countries more in an international module, they can really change the story that you're telling, which lends itself really well to kind of critical debate with the students. And that's just another example, so I won't go through that one. I talked about using student experience more in the tax classes. So some of those challenges there are ones that I've kind of already touched upon. Students not connecting or relating with some of the examples that we're studying. So what I really want is for students to, over the kind of year of this module, to know where they stand on tax issues, on tax policy, on tax law, and not just have taken on board what I've told them. And I think that will really help to break that what I think is one of the core stereotypes around international students, that they're not capable of deeper critical thinking type learning, which they absolutely are, but it's up to us to kind of equip them with the right tools to be able to do that. There's lots of literature about the use of diverse case studies, but also involving students in case studies, which kind of separately from the example I just used, I would like to do some student-led teaching with my international students where they will kind of research a particular tax law or policy issue in their home country, or perhaps in another country that they're particularly interested in, and they will then present that to the class, prepare questions for the rest of the class to kind of look into. And I'm also thinking about using blogs as well as a sort of alternative format for students to be able to bring in their own perspective on particular tax issues. And in doing that, what I think will be really nice is that we will build up a kind of student-led reading list or list of resources, rather than it just being the kind of reading list that I impose on them. So things like, an example I thought of, a case study student could look at would be like the sort of tax administration system in their home country, to analyse whether something like a one-stop shop system for VAT would be kind of plausible in their country. And that would really allow a sort of critical analysis of VAT reform proposals from multiple perspectives. And that's when they really will start kind of moving up that kind of learning chain. I'm not talking about Bloom's taxonomy, but you know, that sort of thing. And then materials, just the last kind of couple of things, what I found particularly difficult, and if people have recommendations, I would love to hear them, because I'm still getting to grips with all of the academic literature, but finding appropriate and up-to-date international textbooks on tax law and policy I found quite difficult, at least ones that are accessible for students who are still, you know, learning the English language. A lot of journal articles on the reading list are really challenging. Like, I find them challenging to read, but they're still on there for the students to read. And I had lots of emails this year about students, you know, kind of, please, is there a really basic textbook that we can just use as a starter? And I've really struggled to find that, particularly for VAT. I think I've found more on the sort of corporate taxes side, but so any recommendations would be welcome. But the telling thing was that when it came to assessments, so we currently assess by an essay in each semester, a lot of the essays didn't even refer to the materials on the reading list. And that is, you know, a telltale sign that, well, one, they hadn't read them, and presumably because they couldn't understand them. Because I think, you know, as a student, you would assume your first part of call would be to go to the reading list that you're given as a starter, and like what you looked at in the seminar, and then build on that. But that wasn't being done. And I've put a challenge on there as my voice. There's not a lot that I can do about that, but I have had lots of comments about students struggling to understand me. So I'm trying to be less northern, but it's challenging. So instead, I'm going to do these other things. So really trying to assist students in breaking down some of the complexities in the reading materials, making sure that I have read them all in detail. I'm revising the reading list at the minute, and I think there are quite a few that I am going to get rid of on the basis of the less is more thing that I was talking about. And I'm going to introduce this idea. Again, this was an idea I got from a colleague in the Languages Centre about having kind of core concepts for each session, and really kind of drilling those and making sure that every student, when they leave the class, has kind of demonstrated that they have at least an understanding of those core concepts, which will hopefully then allow them to go away and at least kind of follow the reading with a bit more ease. So the preparatory questions for the class, I think, will be I'm going to make much more guided in terms of helping the students to follow through some of the articles and the reading. And I think, you know, if I do have more students with English as their first language, I still think, you know, this will be useful for them because, as I said, I find some of these articles difficult to read. Using things like jargon busters as suggested in the literature is a good way. Again, I mentioned kind of repetition of concepts is really important for students and for students still learning the English language. So that is the sort of thing that I would like to start using. So this is just one small example, but you know, looking at that makes you think there is so much kind of gobbledygook in tax, and it really does kind of bring home. I think it's really easy to forget when you have become a tax person. And you've been a tax person for a long time, that it is actually a really challenging area in terms of just the basics, the basic language. And then the last thing, encouraging students to take tax beyond the classroom. So I've seemed to have had a lot of what you might call strategic learners. They only really care about what the essay is going to be about, and anything beyond that they're not as keen to engage with. But the trouble is, you know, as I said, students weren't even using the reading list for the assessments. So they really care about the assessment, but they haven't, you know, got a good enough grasp of what we've covered to be a good strategic learner. So what I have found as well is that tax has been a really popular dissertation subject, but when I've then been assigned students and they come to me like, oh, I want to do something on tax, I'm like, okay, what? And again, that signaled to me that that student had a feeling that they liked tax, but they hadn't developed any sort of tax identity or been impacted by the module in any way, because if they had, they would have come and said, oh, I've got this great idea, or I really loved what we did on this and I really want to think about that further. So I would like to, you know, hope that next year with the kind of changes to the module that I'll have more students that are kind of motivated to do tax dissertations in particular areas. And I think getting them to think about tax as a dissertation subject as soon as possible at the start of the module will hopefully be helpful for that. I'm going to have some guest speakers coming in, so again, give students a break from my voice, but also to give them a different perspective on what you might do with tax, because I talk a lot about my experience in practice with the students, but that's just one. And you know, I can obviously talk to them about being a tax academic, but there are lots of other, as we know, ways in which we can use tax for careers. So I've hopefully got someone from the Chartered Institute coming in, and also someone from ICAS to talk about devolved taxes. So lots of kind of interesting angles. Ultimately, with the aim of kind of connecting students with the tax research world, so that hopefully our kind of tax community within that little module will help students to kind of branch out into the wider tax world, which I myself am still kind of getting to grips with. So those are kind of all the sort of key points that I wanted to reflect on. It feels a bit like I'm kind of throwing the kitchen sink at it, which I am in a way, to try and see, you know, what will kind of work well and what won't. So there'll be a kind of later reflection on it after the next year. But I'm really doing this because I think it's our kind of duty as lecturers, as teachers, to really care about what our students are getting out of our module. And I can say this in this room without fear of being judged, but I really love tax. And I don't want, I guess my fear is I don't want my kind of enthusiasm about it to be dampened by the fact that my students aren't really engaging with it. And I know, you know, people would say, you know, they kind of turn to their research for that, but the teaching is such a big part of my job. And I think if I can be seen as someone who really cares about the subject and cares about my students, then that will hopefully allow them to kind of thrive as tax law students and hopefully become some of the tax law professionals of the future. So I think I'm sorry I'm a little bit over time. But yeah, I'd thank you for listening, and I'd love to hear any ideas of how people have made or would think about making their tax teaching inclusive. Thank you.